It was now the beginning of August in 1945, and as all our training programs had ended, we were regarded as being fully trained and ready for posting to an active service regiment for service overseas. So we were first dispatched by train to London and then transferred to a connecting train which took us across to Norwich, situated in the southeast county of Norfolk, and finally onto a small town called Cromer, which in peacetime was a coastal seaside holiday resort, a nice place altogether. Not only did we find our new barracks to be as good as a hotel, we actually discovered it was a real hotel. It was actually the Cliftonville Hotel, which had been taken over by the government to serve as a barracks for our new regiment, the 56th Medium Regiment of Royal Artillery, to which we had been assigned. The bedrooms were lovely and large and capable of taking 4 or 5 single beds, and we had a grand view looking out our fabulous bay windows at the seaside views outside. It couldn't get much better than that, could it? Even though we were not actually gunners, it came as no surprise to us to be told that we were required to do some additional training and practice on the new artillery medium guns, and they were massive. They weighed 6 tons and were 25 feet long and needed a team of 10 men to handle them, 2 of which were necessary to lift the 100-pound shells into the breech. I can tell you that this training and practice was quite punishing and physically strenuous for me, still a skinny 18-year-old boy. At the end of our first week, some members of our squad had been selected to be posted to Germany. And this was a particularly sad moment for us because we had been together for 7 months and became good pals with each other. So this splitting up and separation was a bit of a sad event, but one of these things that you have to get used to in the army. But also, at the same time, we learned on the BBC News that the American Air Force had dropped its first nuclear atom bomb on Japan, on the city of Hiroshima. And this was done in order to hope to persuade Japan to consider a surrender.
The crew released the bomb despite more clouds. This time there was no firestorm.
But the Japanese military commanders refused and said they would rather die than give up fighting. So 3 days later, a further, even more horrific and devastating hydrogen atom bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. And it completely wiped out the whole city in seconds and killed over 50,000 of its population.
That's the atomic bomb exploding at Nagasaki. The film was taken in a B-29 many miles away. All of you who see this picture can judge for yourselves the extent of the menace to civilization of this new weapon.
This was so devastating and horrific that the Emperor of Japan, considering the terrible fear of the possibility of the whole country being destroyed, he decided to intervene and overrule his military commanders and offer surrender to end the war in total. And finally, the war was ended at last.
The war was over.
Nevertheless, we still had to continue our further gunnery drills and practices, even on one occasion, having the whole regiment drive across in convoy 240 miles to Tills Head in Salisbury Plains. That was an area that was assigned primarily for artillery manoeuvres. And we stayed there for a week, practicing with live ammunition, a truly awesome experience. But mostly, back in Cromer, whilst waiting for our eventual postings overseas, many hours were spent absolutely doing nothing at all. Nothing at all. Boring, boring, boring. Eventually, on the 11th of October, we were all given 2 weeks home leave, which was a grand opportunity for me to catch up with my pals and friends at my workplace, clubs, etc. But surprisingly, I also decided to revisit Blackburn of all places, especially to renew and to recapture my personal friendship with Dorothy Brakel, a very special girlfriend from my time when I was previously stationed there, and with whom we used to regularly meet, to go dancing and share our time at clubs, etc. It was a very brief but very happy reunion, and we decided to keep in touch with each other by letter as often as we could, and which we did for all of the time while I was abroad. At the end of our leave, we all returned back to Cromer to learn that we were soon to be sent abroad, and the subsequent issue of lightweight tropical uniforms confirmed our destination to be in the Far East. We all decided to go out for a few beers, not so much as to celebrate, but rather to say our farewells to England, as we were now destined for SEAC, which was the South East Asian Command. We finally learned that our destination was to be the city of Bombay in India. So on the 5th of November 1945, we were taken by train down to the port of Southampton in order to find and to board our troopship, which in fact turned out to be the Ile-de-France, which originally had been France's largest luxury liner. In fact, it was the 5th largest liner in the world in those days, which was a considerable size. But since then, it had been converted into a troopship, carrying 5,000 troops at a time. So following the boarding, which took 2 full days, we eventually set sail the following morning. And we, my pals and I, wandered up to the top deck and wistfully and melancholily leant across the rails and watched the coastline of England and Dover disappear into the background, to be gone for some time. And we wistfully thought, just when would it be when we would eventually return home again? Having left England, it wasn't too long before we actually came into sight of the West African coastline, where the ship was then directed towards the port of Freetown in order that we should dock and refuel and replenish our supplies. And the following morning, we set sail once again for a 7-day journey down to the port of Cape Town, which was in fact the capital city of South Africa. And when we arrived there, we were delighted with the news that all of us had been granted the freedom of shore leave to go ashore during the afternoon and the evening to enjoy ourselves and to stretch our legs. And my pal and I think foolishly, gorged ourselves on the local exotic fruits and bought many sweets and bars of chocolate, etc., things which we had been denied during the war years. And we were also delighted as we wandered the town to be stopped by local residents to ask how we were and how things were back in dear old England. It was a truly wonderful afternoon and evening, a real joy of this visit to Cape Town. Next morning we set sail once more, and for the very first time we experienced a very serious rolling ship tossing about in the very stormy seas of the Cape of Good Hope, which later calmed down as we entered what was known as the Mozambique Channel, and to arrive 6 days later at the port of Mombasa in East Africa. After our final refueling overnight, we set sail the next morning on the very last leg of our long and arduous journey, and finally arriving a week later at the port of Bombay, the capital city of India. After such a long journey, we struggled ashore with our kit bags down the busy gangplank on the morning of the 6th of December, setting foot in a new and mysterious country and wondering, apprehensively, just what now lay before us. When we landed in Bombay, we were taken by truck to the railway station and put on a train which took us on a 4-hour journey to a place called Dulali, which was a military reception camp for all newcomers to the region. And we stayed there for just over a week, receiving lots of advice and warnings and situations concerning our safety, particularly because since the war had ended, there was a rising political group called Jai Hind, which meant quit India, and they were becoming acutely aggressive and perhaps with the threat of killing in order to seek independence from British rule, and they wanted total independence to run their own country without the English being there. And they were prepared to kill for it, I can tell you. And surprisingly, in a couple of years, they achieved independence. And instead of killing the English, they started killing each other, and still do to this day. So much for progress. We received lots of lectures and things like that, but we were told particularly never to go down to the local bazaars or markets alone, always to go down in groups, and the larger the group, the safer it would be for us, because it was really a dangerous situation. But we had to go because it was just a break from the monotony and the boring existence within the camp. But nevertheless, I remember particularly one evening when I was personally on guard duty at the bazaars, as we occasionally had to do, and I was with my pal, armed with a rifle and bayonet, etc. And we were standing talking, my pal and I, and we were supported by 2 Gurkha soldiers. And interrupted me. One said, Sab, you mustn't stand like that. Always, and he turned us so one was facing the other. He says, you can look over his shoulder and he can look over your shoulder. Always safety, making sure that no one can come behind you and stab you in the back. And I can tell you, that caused me a bit of concern for the rest of the evening. I was really worried. We were later moved to another camp called Lake Beale, and as the name would give you a clue, the camp was adjoining a massive lake some 6 miles across. And I remember the size particularly because we regularly were given route marches around the perimeter, the 12-mile perimeter of the lake, supposedly to toughen us up. But I never felt any tougher, just sheer exhaustion from the cruelty of the NCOs that made us march in the midday sun. But during our leisure hours, and there were many, we were permitted to swim and boat in the lake. It was fantastic. a sheer pleasure. We enjoyed that quite often. And at the time, we were also had our khaki drill uniforms taken from us and exchanged for what was known as jungle green. And having also been given an extra vaccination for cholera and introduced a medication, Mepicrin, for anti-mosquito and malaria troubles, it was a clear sign that we were now being readied for our posting to Burma. And because of the impending move, I hastily gathered together my gifts and novelties which I had purchased from the local bazaars and markets and parceled them up, ready for posting off to my family and to my girlfriend, Dorothy. But time now has moved on and became Christmas Eve, and have found that we were all congregate together in the evening around massive bonfires and singing carols, thinking of home. And then, of course, Christmas Day, the following day, it was a novelty day because the tradition is that the officers became our waiters for the serving of Christmas dinner. Quite a novelty indeed. But then finally, on Boxing Day, which was my 19th birthday, we had to pack up all our belongings and were taken to the railway station and put on a troop train, ready for our long and arduous journey across to Calcutta, some 1,500 miles across the widest part of the country. I need to remind you that the trains in India were very old-fashioned compared to our own, and as a consequence they were quite slow also, which meant that our journey across India was going to take 4 days and 4 nights before we reached Calcutta. And to add to our problems, the compartments had no provision for lying down, just wooden seats in a fixed upright position, so sleep was both painful and totally inadequate for the whole journey. And with regard to meals, we were reliant upon calling at particular stations where the local merchants would come and provide tea and sandwiches. Tea and sandwiches for 4 days. I can tell you, we were quite hungry by the time we got to Calcutta. You may have heard the old phrase that mad dogs and Englishmen play out in the midday sun. And I mention this because of one occasion where we needed to stretch our legs as we reached certain stations. And when we went onto the platforms, one of the lads decided, they said, how about we have a game of cricket in order to get some exercise? And we thought, oh, it was a great idea. It was, but in fact, it was impossible in a sense because we had neither bats nor balls. But nevertheless, we did set up a team to play cricket with an imaginary bat, an imaginary ball. And the local population could see that we were quite mad, even though we were enjoying ourselves. The bowler would come up and bowl the ball, the imaginary ball, and the batsman would bat it back to the bowler and so on. And this was going on for quite some time. And it got the people engaged in watching us quite seriously. But the game went on so far that the local young kids, the juniors, asked if they could join the game with us, and happily chased after the ball and supposedly threw it back to the bowler or try to catch it, etc. It was totally a mad situation, but a very happy one and a very laughable one to cheer us up for the journey. Having finished our meals and our games, it was important now to reboard the train in order to continue on our journey. But it was important to note also that the old carriages that we had no toilet facilities on board at all, none at all. So it was very important for us all to use the facilities on the station before boarding the carriage. And anyway, I mention this because of a problem which was created by and for our pal Harry Mangum, who was a typical Cockney comedian type of lad, always joking, always having a carry on. But we were journeying through the countryside and he said, "My God, I've got a terrible problem. Nature is taking control and my stomach is boiling and I need to go to the toilet. What am I going to do?" And of course, none of us had the answer. What could he do? We didn't want him making a mess within the carriage. It was horrible, the thought of it. He said, I know, I've got a solution. A bit precarious, but I'm going to do it anyway. But he said, it needs for me to, I'm going to strip off. Strip off what for? He says, you'll see. So he took off his clothing, his jacket, his shorts and everything, totally naked, and stepped to the door of the carriage and stepped onto the step in order as though he was departing the train, and swung around from the door to the rear of the train where, and the old trains where you had the metal ladders running up from the bop up to the roof of the carriage. So he stepped onto the ladders outside the train, swung around so that he put his left foot onto the rung of the adjoining carriage and put his right foot on his own carriage, and then reached up and held on to the upper rails of the ladders. So there he was, totally naked, almost a crucified body between the carriages. And he was just slowly lowering himself into a squatting position, when in fact the train just slowed down and entered the next station and drew up to the platform, to the consternation of everyone on the platform, men, women and children squealing and shouting and wondering what the hell was going on. Here's a train coming into the station with a naked Englishman crucified across the carriages, wondering what the hell was going on. I should imagine they were thinking mad dogs and Englishmen. But it was so funny, hilarious in fact. I've never forgotten it, not even to this day.